Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to the Muslim Matters podcast. I'm your host, Zainab bint Yunus, and today I'm joined by my co hosts, Irtaza Hassan and Siraj Muhammad. This episode will, inshallah, be the first of several dedicated to all things Muslim and money: what we think about money, what we think we know about money, how we handle it or don't, what we really need to know about money before we get married, and how to have money conversations with our kids and, as they age, our parents. And before we speak to actual experts in future episodes, I want this episode to set the stage for our listeners to realize that everyone is at different stages of financial literacy and money management in their lives. So you two are established men with marriages and children under your belt. So I'm curious to hear from you guys about your own journeys as Muslims figuring out how to manage money, especially when it comes to issues like avoiding riba in the face of cultural or family pressure. So Siraj, I'm going to pick on you first. Give us a little bit of background on your family background, how that impacted you learning about money growing up, and how that informed your adult decision making around finances.
Assalamu alaikum. Thanks for having me. Yeah, so my background in money is actually it's been a journey because my family did not really teach me the basics of budgeting and financial literacy and how to invest or anything like that. They were very good at providing them. I mean, they always made sure that whatever our financial situation was, we were always eating, we had clothes, we felt secure. So there was never any sort of insecurity in that way. But in terms of just how to manage money and how to think about money and how to be smart and invest in the future, there was maybe a little bit of discussion when I was younger about, oh, you should put money in a savings account, but there was really not a whole lot of enforcement. And I would also say that in our house, we were not a strict practicing Muslim family household as well. So the idea of, for example, taking mortgages, credit cards, riba in general, there was no problem with that. I would even say in some cases, there would be some other sort of shady financial transactions, like not financial transactions, but just ways of operating like gambling and so forth that's okay. We can overlook that. But once I got to college, I encountered what many college students encounter, which is you can get credit cards. And if you just get a t-shirt or we'll give you a t-shirt and just sign up for a credit card. And I used to be on America Online as well. They would even give you pop-up ads, even back then, back in the 90s for, hey, just sign up and you can get credit cards. So I very rapidly found myself spending, getting myself in debt, and then not knowing how the money goes back and gets paid. And of course, that didn't go so well with my parents. It was taken care of. Over the years, I started learning little by little how to budget. I had to start taking care of bills and what have you.
When did
And
that start?
that started actually as soon as I was in college, actually. I'd say my sophomore year when I had my own apartment, I had to start learning how to pay bills. And the whole concept of going to like a store or going to some depot or mailing something out where I have to pay bills and pay it on time. To be honest, that wasn't really taught to me. And so I had to learn that and I had to make mistakes and a few times had things turned out on me even. But you learn. And over time, I started saying, what's a better way to do this? And I started reading books that talk about, why don't you just automate it? I know some people don't like to automate it because they like to see when things go out and they like to ledger it themselves by hand or write it into whatever book they have. But I was the type of person that was like, okay, if I do it the other way, if I don't automate it, I'm just going to let it go. So I learned very quickly to take care of my bills that way, just to put it in some type of automation infrastructure and get it out of the way. So that was really where I started and how I continued as a young man. Eventually, I did come to the realization that I also had to budget. But again, I hated the whole process of having to write down transactions. I think I used to see some people who were very good about it. They would have a checkbook where they would manually write every single transaction they did, groceries and bills and everything. And again, that was not for me. But we also came into this time when programs like mint.com were there. So we were able to very quickly integrate all your accounts and see all your information. So that's how I eventually learned to start budgeting myself. And that's how I came into it.
So what about you? What was your experience like in contrast? What were the main factors that influenced how you learned about money, what you thought about money, especially when you were younger? Were you ever taught how to manage money? And if so, how?
Firstly, Zainab, I want to say that really these sessions, I'm really excited about these. I'm personally looking forward to the experts who come on later because I think we can all benefit from it. For me, growing up, born and raised in America, in Houston, Texas, I would say up until high school, there was not a lot of focus or kind of concentration on the value of money or even really the purpose. I did some high school jobs, like summer jobs here or there, a restaurant or a coffee shop. And it was more like you get a paycheck and you spend it or have fun with it, spend it on video games or whatever you're going to do. I would say my first exposure really to money that was more eye-opening was in college. And there were a couple things I'll tell you. For me, going to college here at University of Houston, most of my friends were Muslim in college. And I noticed some of them, even 18, 19 years old, they would be very wise about their money. I remember I had a friend, he worked on campus. He had a good student job, 20, 25 hours a week. And he would always mention how he would try to save 20, 25%. Now, whether that was his parents guiding him or he himself had the foresight, I always remember that because a lot of students between paying back a student loan or going out for pizza or food on the weekends, or they're not really thinking about saving money. So generally, I would say college is when firstly became aware of it. And I'll tell you one thing for me that was the sore spot, and I think it first opened my eyes about finances. And I'm seeing this now as someone who's in his mid 40s. I was in college and I remember you're incoming freshman and they do all these welcome events. And at the University of Houston, like many American colleges, you're 18, you can apply for a credit card in your own name. And I think the credit limits back then would be about $5,000 or $7,000, something like that. And I was one of those unfortunate ones or unwise ones who went and applied, got a credit card right away, very quickly ran up the entire balance, wound up missing some of his mandatory payments or minimum payments, or even when you make the payments, the amount of interest that wound up. And obviously I didn't understand that much about interest at the time and how serious it is, both Islamically and otherwise, how predatory it is. And alhamdulillah, I had parents who helped me get out of it, but it was just an extremely irresponsible decision. And it was really on frivolous stuff and just fun and hanging out with your friends or road trips. And so what am I doing? And the unfortunate, and so I'm thankful to Allah for helping me have that one lesson and kind of learn from it. I don't use credit cards today. I really stopped using them after I left college. But I'll tell you, Zainab, I see people today in their 40s like me or 30s, or they never grew out of that, whether you want to call it being irresponsible with debt or using credit cards or maxing out two, three, four, and then just always being in debt and always being stressed out, frankly. And look, I know people have to take care of their families. You got to take care of the spouse, the kids. I know people have bills. Some people are going to say, don't judge me. You don't know what I'm going through. I use credit cards because I have to, or whatever their mindset. The reality is, wherever you're using it, it's an extremely predatory, difficult structure. And I see so many friends, they can't come out of it, or they'll do a second side job or something else because they literally cannot pay out of their debt. And so I know some people are blessed with much, much more money. They never have to think about credit card payments or loans or whatever. But for many Muslims, that's just not true. And so I would say, again, this is my journey. I'm not an expert in finance, but I would definitely say someone about in his 20s and 30s really started to appreciate the importance of it and kind of make a good plan for it.
I appreciate you guys sharing that because it goes to show the diversity of perspectives that people come with. So my experience was very different from both of yours. My dad's an imam. So growing up, we actually had it pretty strongly drilled through our heads that you avoid debt at all costs. You avoid credit card debt at all costs. If you need to use one for legal reasons or whatever practical reasons, especially in Canada, there's going to be companies or bills that you can't pay off your debit. It has to be on your credit card. You treat it as though it is your debit account. You only put money on that you have and nothing else. So had it pretty strongly drilled into pretty much be petrified of debt. The hadith about not praying janazah on the person who dies with debt. So that was a pretty strong lesson. But then also just practical immigrant stuff between my grandparents and my parents being pretty frugal, budgeting very carefully. So that's a very interesting contrast to me compared to what you guys had. For me as well, difference being that I didn't go to college right away. I did get married first. And that's a bit of a different experience and different story. So Suraj, you talked about how in college you decided to get your act together financially and you did research and learning about managing your money. What were some of the resources that you used?
Let's see. In college, I can't even remember now what I started using in college. Usually it ended up being some type of search online. That's really where I started learning because I didn't have resources. I didn't have people resources. I didn't have mentors at that time. So it was a hodgepodge of advice here and there. One of the first people, actually, I'll tell you, who I benefited after I got out of college, and I was, let's see, it was my first year, second year. I was working at Motorola, and Sheikh Muhammad Sharif, actually, rahimahullah, he had contacted me, and he was doing a pilot coaching service. This is before he started doing Discover You, and he was taking on just a few clients, and when we were establishing the Qabila, he was like, hey, would you want to do coaching on the side? And so I said, sure. And we started just talking through different personal development issues, and he would give me advice and the usual coaching spiel about let me help you figure out what you have to do. So he asked me, what are some of the things you want to work on? And one of them was actually the financial side, because by the time I had gotten out of college, I had racked up a lot of debt, both on my name, and then also my parents had the student or the Parent Plus loans as well, but I had to contend with mine. So I started saying, yeah, I want to figure out how to get out of these debts, how to pay them off. And he had recommended this wealth transformation program. So I paid the full amount. It was pretty expensive, but I paid for it. It wasn't through him. It was another one that he was recommending. And it essentially recommended how you go about paying off your debts, how to think about the ideas around consumerism, how they impact you, and why you should not let yourself be led down that path. And then it provided a very interesting method. And I think it's well known. It's called the debt snowball. I think Dave Ramsey also talks about it. But it essentially was advocating exactly how you should pay off all your credit card debts. And so I started using that. I didn't have credit card debts like that, but I had my student loans. So I started using that system and paying for my bills. Eventually, I did pay it all off, but not because of that system. But that was my first, I would say, foray into understanding just how to handle debts and how to think about debts and paying them off. In terms of budgeting, that came later. I think that came much later. I had this idea in my head of the finances are a black box. And as long as you have a rough idea that you have enough money in your bank account, then you should be okay. And you should be able to pay off your debts and not fall into debt. Or you should be able to pay off your bills, rather, pay off your groceries and everything else, not fall into debt. And if there's any time you're getting close to the limits of your budget, then you should just back off and tell everyone else in the house they have to back off. That's not the best way to run it. I think there's a variation of that now, where people talk about you have your fixed costs, your flexible costs, and then your non-recurring monthly costs or something like that, where people budget that way as well. I had a variation of that way back when I was first budgeting.
Siraj, as I was listening to you, and for the listeners, I want you all to know that me and Siraj did not discuss this beforehand or plan this, but my story here is actually also about Sheikh Muhammad al-Sharif, Allah yarhamu. And I have a really interesting story. I remember it vividly. Honestly, I remember like it was yesterday. It was 2006. We had gone for Hajj. Some of the years, myself and Siraj were early pioneers working with the Maghrib Institute in different capacities. So I had opportunity a few years in a row to go for Hajj with Sheikh Muhammad. And one of the years we went, in the days we were in Medina, and at this time, this is 2006. So Maghrib Institute, for the listeners, it's probably the biggest thing in North America at the time in terms of English-based Islamic studies. You're in about 11 cities from California to New Jersey. And no matter what ideology or what type of preferences most Sunni Muslim family kids had, they were coming to a Maghrib Institute, most likely. So we're in Medina, and we hear that some of the students at that time from Medina University wanted to come grab breakfast or lunch with Sheikh Muhammad. So he tells me, hey, do you want to come? It's like younger students, undergrads, first year, second year. And he even made a joke. He goes, we can scope out future talent for Maghrib. But then he was like, let's go give salams and meet them. So we go in one of the hotels and meet, and some of these brothers are more social. Some of them have like pens and pads out. They're going to ask some questions, or it's going to wind up becoming a little more intense discussion. And I remember Sheikh Muhammad after breakfast just takes the floor, and all he talks to these guys, there's about 15 guys, all Westerners, all Canadians or Americans, maybe a couple Brits, but I don't remember. He pretty much talked to them about finances. He goes, you're going to countries that don't necessarily respect or value the imam role. You're going to have difficulty. You're going to be broke. You're going to have this, that, and the other. And he started telling them that even if you're in the College of Hadith, College of Sharia, whatever you're doing, start to think of your project. Start to think of what you're going to do. Fine, be an imam when you come back. No problem. There's honor in that. It's a great thing to do. But what else are you going to do? How are you going to bring food to the table? How are you going to help the wife and kids? And maybe one of you is going to start an Arabic program. Maybe one of you is going to do this. Maybe one of you is going to do Muslim travels. Maybe. And I remember the whole discussion wound up being about financial security, about financial common sense, about financial literacy. And he was telling them that we're not going to have strong Muslim communities if we don't have strong Muslim families. And you're not going to have strong Muslim families if people aren't comfortable financially. If you're only worried about your finances and where your next meal is coming from, and your car breaks down and you don't have the money to get basic repairs, you're never going to have that peace of mind. And so I remember that like it was yesterday because I was looking at the faces of these Medina grads and you could tell they'd never heard this. He basically was talking in different language for them and they appreciated it. A lot of them really appreciated it. They stayed afterwards. They thanked him for it. They didn't expect a sheikh, a former alumni from Medina University to come out and talk about finances and how to plan. And that's not what they expected from that breakfast. But again, I remember being quite valuable. So that's my memory. And again, this is 2006. So this is 20 years. And I remember it like it was yesterday.
That's really great to hear, actually, because that was definitely a feature that I considered and talked to my dad about later on as I got older. I was like, how did you figure out your finances? Recently, I was talking to him about literally his early days after graduating when he was imam here in Victoria already for 3 years. And I was like, wait a second, like just last night, I asked him, I was like, hang on a second. What did you do for money? And he was like, nothing. There was a full-time imam position, but completely volunteer based. But he was technically unemployed. So alhamdulillah, like my grandparents were around, but he didn't have a game plan at the time because that was not something that anyone prepared you for at the University of Medina. They teach you fiqh and usul and all that kind of stuff. They don't teach you what are you going to do when you graduate and how you're going to keep a job. So I'm glad you shared that, and I'm glad that Sheikh Muhammad Sharif was able to play that mentorship role because people before that clearly didn't have that. So it says that after that story, which was again really interesting, what were the couple of resources that you learned from on how to figure out your financial management? And at what age did you really start buckling down over that?
So I'll tell you, for me early on, I'm not, again, not a finance expert. So I took a little more simplistic view where I've kept all my money basically in checking accounts. Obviously, savings account, you don't want to accrue interest. And then I was like, okay, I don't really know much about stocks or the stock market or investing. So I'm going to stay away from that. Not because it's haram or halal. I just don't know it. And so my biggest thing was, okay, I'll just earn what I can earn. And alhamdulillah, I've always had a pretty good corporate job. And I was like, whatever else, I'll just put in savings and checking. And so then a few years go by, I get more in my late 20s, and you start talking to other brothers who are, they're practicing Muslims traditional and they care a lot about their deen. And then you come across people who have more expertise and they'll be like, wait a minute, there are Sharia compliant funds. And I'm like, what is that? And they're like, go read up on this or talk to this brother from Saturna Capital or Amana, or there's Wahid. And for me, again, this was all like a new language. So I was like, okay, and I was skeptical. I was like, Sharia compliant, is that even possible? What does that mean? And then my own brother, younger than me, had always been, he is finance minded. He comes from finance background. He was like, I do that. I do halal investing. And I talked to some other, so I read up a little on that. But another thing, there's two other things I'll tell you about myself, Zainab. And I'll say this to brothers who are listening, especially when you're married. Marriage is a partnership. And there's things you're going to be more knowledgeable about, or one spouse is going to be better. One spouse is going to have an expertise or an experience that the other doesn't. So I'll give my wife credit on this one. She early on told me, she said, what about real estate? She was from a second or third generation real estate family. And I said, what do you mean? This is in our 20s. So I said, we haven't paid off our house. She goes, exactly. She goes, right now, let's work to pay off our house that we had gotten on a Islamic finance. And I know that there could be questions about that, but that's not the purpose of my commentary here. We had used early Islamic finance with guidance for our first home. So she was like, let's pay it off quickly. Let's pay off this loan. And then after that, let's save money. And when we have enough money, see if we can get a condo, get something supplementary, something for halal income. And there were many reasons for that. One was, again, to have a halal income, some stability. And the other was, okay, what if, and we talked about this way back then, not due to any political reason or any crisis. What if we wanted to at some point live abroad, live in a Muslim country, live in a land that was a little bit cheaper where you could have a good quality living? So these things, it was like our late 20s. And my wife planted these seeds with me about, hey, let's pay off the house quickly. And then if we, after that, because we didn't really believe you could take a second loan on a rental. So it's like, okay, then save money. And in Houston, Texas at that time, rental properties were quite affordable. If you worked at it a little bit, it wasn't like the markets of Vancouver or New York or California. This is, again, talking like mid 2000s, Houston, Texas. And so there was that. And then a third thing I'd like to tell you, Zainab, this is not from me or the wife or anything about different brothers advising about, hey, look into halal stock or halal funds. I can't tell you all how often in my 20s or 30s, I would see someone in the community, a respected uncle, an auntie, an elder, maybe one of my friend's parents, just either pass away or have a major health episode, like a major stroke. And then the uncle is never the same after that, or a major a heart attack or some type of cancer where maybe it doesn't take their life, but they're never the same. And literally, in many cases, the aunties wouldn't know the basics. Like the comment would
Yeah.
be, they don't know where the checkbook is. They don't know. And this is not saying something to mock those aunties or make fun of them, not at all. But it's more a comment. It's more, how could that be? We're not saying you have to be the breadwinner. We're not saying you have to work. No, but like something that basic in a Western society where literally your bills, your children, your like knowing stuff like that. And so it just opened my eyes that, man, we all need to at least know some basics. Whether you consider yourself a financial person or not, there's some basics none of us can afford not to know basics around these things.
Yeah, I will chime in on that and say it is really concerning that happens. And obviously, it's not their fault. It's just the continuation of their cultural practices or norms around women not being involved in finances. And actually, I can speak to that oddly enough, despite being raised in the West. It was my parents' household were the old school Salafi, and there was no sense of there was no consideration that I would ever need a bank account or a credit card or any of that because it was assumed that was going to be my husband's business. I did have my own money, and we were very immigrant oriented in the sense that you keep cash on hand and you don't trust the banks, which honestly, that is something that I abide by now as well, as much as possible. But in terms
How about the gold too?
Yes, and the gold. So, of course, every ethnic girl knows your biggest investment in life is gold jewelry. So, yeah, the usual DC thing of you're given gifts of gold when you're a child. When you're older, you purchase gold if you can, and you hoard that and you hold on to that like a dragon because that is going to be your lifesaver. And I still abide by that. And I've been pushing that on my daughter as well, who she doesn't see the need for it at all and she doesn't think it's particularly worth fussing over, but I'm quite adamant about this because as we know, gold is that one form of asset that is going to last you pretty much anywhere and everywhere and can always be liquidated when necessary. But going back to the aunties not knowing how to do anything, how to do the banking, what to access, what accounts their husbands had, I'm going to throw out there that even if you are a very religious household, please make sure that your daughters know this. I had to learn it quite the hard way during my first marriage when I had no access to any bank accounts, not my ex-husband's. I had none of my own. And then when I restarted the next chapter of my life, I had to learn all that from scratch. And it's really embarrassing being in your 20s and having no idea how a bank account works. So please don't do that.
I'll say in my household, I think it's fair to say my mother would be considered an auntie, but she's also, I would say she would be under a class of exceptional aunties who are professionals who know their way not only professionally around their occupation, but also she was the one who was handling all the finances and she knows everything, like all the accounts, all the investments, all the payments, everything in exquisite detail and knows how to manage and move money around. She knows where all the properties are in this country versus that country and what the investments are. I would say that there's probably a general trend around this. Probably most aunties, as you would say, are in this boat or in this category. But I would just want to just chime in and pipe up for the aunties who are like, not me though. I'm not one of them. I know my mom's one of them, and she probably represents a small group of women who are in the elder generation but know their way around money really well.
That's really important to hear about as well. So thanks for mentioning that. So what would you say are some of the biggest mistakes that you made along the way? You mentioned your credit card story, of course, in college, but was there anything else that stood out to you that now in hindsight you look back and are like, oh, I wish I'd learned this lesson sooner and I hadn't made those mistakes, but it was a learning experience and you want people to learn from that.
So I'll say two things here. And I think it's a great question. For me personally, I'm guessing a lot of the brothers and sisters who are listening, maybe some of this resonates. But for me, two things. One was really valuing earlier on, maybe even in my mid 20s or earlier 20s, is being consistent and regular in savings. After you pay your zakat, after you do your obligations and duties to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, being regular. And I think a lot of us think, okay, savings is not really something for your 20s. Let's on 20s, you're trying to make it, you're trying to maybe get that first house or the car. And I know nowadays when you look at housing prices, people who are in their 20s today actually don't feel that optimistic. I think 20, 30 years ago, it was a different world when it came to these finances. So I didn't take it as seriously in my early and mid 20s. It probably wasn't until my late 20s, almost 30, where I got a little more serious about savings and investing. But another thing I'd like to share, and I'm speaking more obviously as a Muslim on a spiritual angle, and I don't have any science behind this, but for me early on, I was, other than zakat or those things that are obligatory, I would not consider myself the most charitable person, like extra charities where there's things you'll do that are more. Whereas my wife was quite charitable to the point that we got married, we were 23 years old. And sometimes I'd be like, man, that's a lot. Like, you don't have to do that. We could put more towards savings, or it's great. We can do X, Y, Z, but do we have to do that much? And sometimes it would be even some friction. You'd have a conversation about it. And I'll tell you guys again, no science to it. I'm not here trying to pat myself on the back or something like that. Not at all. Stuff. Well, we all know that for all of us, nothing we do is enough before the greatness of Allah. But it was later that I got more serious about some things that you could say are more sadaqah based, and whether that was hit up Islamic relief. And it's like, okay, are there a couple countries where I could help with one of the orphans? Or hey, is there a cause in my local community? Is there a masjid that we know that this masjid doesn't get the love? It has a lot of people, maybe people who became Muslim and it could be in prison and now they're out and they're going to struggle to find a job because society doesn't really credit or reward people who are rehabilitating. Or maybe there's another cause where it needs attention. It could be a water well somewhere. It could be something else. It could be a family that maybe they've lost a parent and they're struggling with bills. And so I would say that in a weird way, because I consider myself today very blessed. I think also Allah is so generous and kind to us and so many resources that he's given. I would say part of that I tie to supplementary sadaqah that is not required, but it's just, and honestly, in another way, it also makes you feel good as well about your risk or about your finances. That, okay, maybe there's a couple $100 that might not be a huge deal to me, but it could make a huge difference for someone else. And that person may make dua for me and essentially it's something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would also reward. And so, again, I don't have some hard science, but I personally, in my personal life, have noticed that there was a big difference when this, and like I said, in my 20s and even up to late 20s, I was not as sadaqah minded, if we can use that word. And it was later. And again, this is something I'll credit my spouse because she was like, look, at the end of the day, whatever's going to come our way is written anyway. Why don't we give a little bit more? That's something I would tell the listeners. And I know sometimes when you're giving, it doesn't make sense, but that money is going to come back to you 10 times over when it's supposed to.
Just adding on top of what you said, Ertaz, one of the things that, along with just automating paying bills, I think we also should look at different charities that we trust and look at just automating paying that on a monthly basis. And it doesn't have to be some big, gigantic amount. I think we tend to think about charity and sadaqah, sometimes even zakat, but mostly sadaqah as just this big amount that we give at fundraisers. But I always find it valuable to find little causes within the community or even outside of the Muslim community. Sometimes there are some humanitarian social causes that we can also donate to, but just giving small amounts on a monthly basis and taking advantage of the hadith of the Prophet that mentions that the best of deeds are those deeds that are done, that are consistent, even if they're small. And I think it's a great way to do it without even having to think about it.
I will co-sign the barakah element and barakah in your risk coming from giving sadaqah. And for those who are in a tight financial spot, by the way, this doesn't just mean that you yourself are giving money and only money as part of sadaqah. Consider the time is part of your sadaqah as well. And many times when I've talked to my parents about my childhood and realizing in hindsight that we were not financially well off at all, like I said, first, like several years after he graduated from Medina, my dad did not have a job, technically speaking. He was working full-time imam without a paycheck. And there were other points in time when, again, he was volunteering as a full-time imam and he was hustling on the side. And I was like, this doesn't even make sense. If you put it on a ledger, none of this will balance out. None of it makes any sense. Like, how did we have a roof over our head? How did we have food on the table? How did we have, alhamdulillah, clothing and other resources? And my dad says, don't count on that. Don't count on the dollars and the cents, but consider what you're doing for the sake of Allah. Allah will always provide. And in different points of my life, I really believe that this tawakkul is what gets you through. So even if you are struggling, even if you're like, the amount of money that's coming into my account this month is not enough to account for what's going out, somehow Allah will provide. And this barakah element is incredibly important. I hope that we can elaborate on this further in future episodes, inshallah, because I think this is a part of money management as a Muslim that very few people think about. I'm glad that you guys brought up the giving and sadaqah, automating your sadaqah, just regular charity, absolutely. But this barakah element comes from multiple different forms. So whether that is that you are giving financially in sadaqah, whether you're giving from your time and your effort, whether it comes from your concern over halal risk, making sure that you're only working in a halal field of work, for example, that you're avoiding any kind of pollution of your income. All those are different elements that contribute to your day-to-day life, really and truly, in ways that you will never expect, that again don't make any sense if you put it on a budget, but in your lived experience that's going to come out. So Irtaza, what is the most important lesson that you think you've learned over the years around money management and living as a Muslim managing your money?
There's a personal lesson I have, which is that we have to put everything in its place. And money is something that is important. It has value in this dunya. And some of what money enables us to do has value for us in the akhirah too, because money can make it easier for you to live a halal lifestyle, to avoid certain types of hardship or difficulty that could test your iman. So I'm not someone who hates money or distances from money or says that money is something we should shun or something in that sense. I understand it's a reality. And that's for me personally. And again, I understand that everybody views money and struggles with money or chases money differently. But my other part I'd like to say is more for the community, that I think Muslims are really quite blessed. And a lot of times we talk about the ummah in terms of all the doom and gloom. But when it comes to money, things are so relative for different people. For some people, you'll see that it's maybe a blessing for them not to have an abundance of money, and they're living their best life in that capacity. And there's other people extremely gifted in money or making money, and money comes and business comes easy to them. They might not always be concerned with the halalness or the Islamic and financial guidelines, and that's for sure an issue. And then you'll have other people who have tremendous amount of knowledge about Islamic finances or ethics or other, but they don't necessarily have money. So what I would love to see on the community side is we have some sort of merger where the people who have the money or they have the investment, they have the entrepreneurship, and the people who have maybe understand the Islamic finances and the ethics and where we should be, there's more collaboration, more partnership, more of this Islamic industry or kind of these markets that are robust, and we make sure they are quote unquote Sharia compliant, but they're looking out for kind of the best interests of the community. So for me, again, there's my personal view on money where I think I'm very comfortable with money today in my 40s than I would have been in my 20s. And it's not necessarily something I chase or lose sleep over. And also because the reality we know that what's written for us is going to come. There's nothing I could do today or say on this podcast or I could do 3 side jobs. What was written for me is going to come to me, and what was not written for me is never going to come to me. But then the other part of it is, how are we handling money as a community, as an ummah? And that's another discussion. So that's how I look at it.
Yeah, I really appreciate those observations, and I invite the listeners to consider their takes on that as well and where they fall under those categories. And yeah, I think that's something that we all need to spend a little more time thinking about, again, positioning ourselves and where we're at. Siraj, what about you? You're somebody who spends a lot of time with personal development and considering broader patterns of these behaviors, tracking patterns from not just within the Muslim community, but from the wider community, including non-Muslims, and how those trends impact Muslims as well. So what are your observations around this with Muslims and money, finances, like we said, trends that you see in broader society that Muslims have absorbed, especially with regards to things that many of us will know in theory, this isn't right, or maybe this isn't the best idea, this is haram, okay, but not such a big deal. What are your perspectives on that?
I can speak to how or what I witnessed growing up and then what I've seen from people that I deal with too. I think in the broader, let's call it the mainstream Muslim community, I think some people would call it the normie community. What I've seen is that most people have absorbed what the rest of society does, and they don't consider things like, for example, I think the biggest investment people believe to be their biggest investment will be buy a house. And so I think within the Muslim community, we tend to hear the debates around mortgages versus Islamic mortgages and so forth. But I think the vast majority of people who are Muslim and taking loans are going to be taking it from a bank, and they'll find a different way to get there if either they just don't really care about the Sharia perspective because they think it's not that big of a deal. And I can understand why they get to that point because they haven't been given the background knowledge and understanding for why riba is such a big deal. Or if they do know it, they reason to themselves that the mortgage is actually cheaper than the Islamic mortgage, and it's also cheaper than rent. So it's okay for them to take a mortgage and save money that way. That's just in terms of the house as an investment. Afterwards, I think you're going to have a range of behaviors from people in terms of credit card spending, putting money into investments. I think that many people will not really consider, as I think Irtiza mentioned earlier, where's their money going in terms of 401ks? Is it a halal investment? Is it Sharia compliant? Some people will, but even then, I would say for myself personally, if you ask me where I'm at with all of these, I try to avoid pretty much everything, like not just the mortgages, but also the Islamic mortgages too. I have my own reservations with that. I do understand that the majority of the scholars here in North America have said that there is some reason to consider them legitimate and make use of them for the purposes of building the Muslim community. And I respect that. I respect anybody else who follows it and truly believes that's the case. Personally, I never felt comfortable with it. So just as a personal preference, I don't do that. I've always rented all my life. And there's lots of debates going back and forth about, is it better to, like, again, going back to houses, is it better to buy? Is it better to rent? And I think there's been a lot of pushback, even in the non-Muslim literature now. I'm thinking of Ramit Sethi as an example, just one example. He's a popular best-selling author, has a huge following for money and finance and building up your wealth. And he personally says he prefers to rent and not buy a house, and makes the case for why it's not a good idea. Personally, for me, besides the riba, the discomfort with the riba side of it, either way with Sharia or non-Sharia compliant loans, I just don't want to maintain a house anyway. I think it's a lot of work and a lot of time and a lot of cost on top of everything else and a lot of stress. I think generally speaking within the community, most of the trends that I've seen are that the community tends to follow what the mainstream is doing. Within I'd say the traditional community, I think people are trying to navigate and find a good combination of Sharia compliant financial instruments. They're trying to find a good combination of Sharia compliant loans. In some cases to very closely mimic the Western lifestyle. In other cases, they take bits and pieces. I have a few friends I know who do a more thorough job of investing in or investigating stocks to make sure they're truly very clean and they're not as, let's say, trusting of even the financial bodies that are like, I won't mention any businesses or names, but they're not completely sold on the mutual funds that exist right now. So they do the work themselves. So there's all types, but I do think that from my perspective, from what I've seen, the majority of people tend to fall into whatever's going on, we're going to follow in the West.
And that's a pretty astute observation and something for all of us to consider when we are managing our money and just pausing and thinking to ourselves, how can I be more intentional about this? And how should my understanding of Islam and what Islam permits when it comes to finances, how can we be more intentional about aligning with those values and with those beliefs, even when it's hard, as you brought up the example of houses and people purchasing houses on various quote unquote Sharia compliant mortgage programs, whatever you want to call them, and just thinking through that a little bit more deeply. Before we end, what are final thoughts, comments, observations that you'd like to share with our listeners? Or what do you think that we need to cover in this series that we haven't really touched on or mentioned, but that really impacts the wider Muslim community in general? Siraj, go ahead.
For me, okay, I'll speak from a very selfish perspective and I'm sure there's a group of people whom I'm representing here in what I'm saying. So as I mentioned earlier, I think that most people are comfortable with investing themselves in pretty much whatever's out there. We've been having conversations too about gambling too. I think that's becoming an issue as well. I've been very hesitant to put my money into anything like stocks, bonds, well, bonds, of course not, but like stocks of any kind, mutual funds of any kind, Sharia compliant or not. And so I find myself in a position where I'm so hesitant to put investments anywhere that there is no investment. I just live on the money that I have. Alhamdulillah, I've always been blessed. I've had barakah that way. And if I've ever needed extra money for whatever reason, I know this is cliche, but the money would just come at different times. I'm not advising anyone that's not a financial plan or a budget of any kind. You should definitely believe in Allah and have tawakkul on Allah. But at the same time, keep in mind, I'm just saying that this is something that's true for me. And that's what I've lived by. So I would be interested in understanding what the best ways are for someone who is very hesitant to put money for Sharia reasons to invest and grow their income so that they can take care of themselves, let's say in retirement, or even get to financial freedom, whatever it may be. What sort of advice do people have, or financial experts who are Muslim that are coming on for this show? What do they have in mind for us that we can take?
Siraj, I think you hit the nail on the head. If I can maybe personalize it a little bit more and take this in a slightly different direction as we're ending. I was recently reading, and we all know that Muslim marriages or Muslim divorce rates in the West have really skyrocketed. There's something like, I've seen in the US numbers out of Houston and Dallas and Chicago about 35, 40%, above 40%. This is in new marriages, more marriages the last 5, 10, 15 years. And it's very much mirroring the non-Muslim numbers. There's not too much of a difference anymore. And where I'm going with this is one of the reports recently and several years in a row shows that the number one reason for divorce, and this surprises many people, it's actually not infidelity, it's not something like that. It's actually financial stress. It's financial mismanagement. In fact, recently I was watching a story of a non-Muslim couple where the wife said she found $15,000, $20,000 of gambling, sports gambling debt, where the husband actually had gambled some of the children's college fund because he was just so certain he could have won. It was like games he was certain about. He was like, they're definitely going to win the money on these basketball or football games. And he lost the money and they divorced. Their marriage did not survive that. And similarly, we know Muslims, all these vices, Muslims without fail are going to follow or fall into, and we know that. And so to me, one of the things about getting your finances right, about following halal finances, financial ethic, being upright in our finances, is it's also going to make you stronger as an individual, as a Muslim, stronger as a spouse, stronger as a family person, a good example as a father to your children, a mother to your children. So I think a lot of this even goes back to the individual level. I agree with everything Suraj said about that some of these discussions about fatwas or financing, and they seem very gray. They leave some stuff to be desired. I think that's there at the higher level, the councils and the imams. But then there's also the importance of financial literacy just to make us better Muslims, to keep us away from certain harmful things or possible haram areas. So I think for me, this is very important. Really looking forward to the guests that Zainab has lined up. And I really think we're all going to be able to benefit from them, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair. I appreciate that you both took the time to jump on this podcast with me and just chat openly and honestly about your experiences, even the less pleasant ones or the more embarrassing ones, because it's important for people to see that they're not alone. Money can be a very uncomfortable topic for some people, even as we live in a society that encourages hyperconsumerism all the time, that's constantly talking about hustling, that's constantly talking about investments. That's such a huge one. And I share sort of skepticism around a lot of that. And it is just so important for us to open up these conversations and just put people at ease. Like I said, people are not alone with these questions, with these experiences. And I'm hoping that this series, inshallah, will be an opportunity for Muslim Matters to help provide guidance and life lessons for those who haven't been through these experiences already, and for those who are looking to set up their life with more barakah and more financial health as well, inshallah. So, jazakumullah khair, both of you, for joining and having this conversation with me. And to our listeners, please feel free to leave your own questions, bring up topics that you want covered in the rest of the series, and stay tuned for the next episode of the Muslim Matters Financial Literacy Series podcast, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Hey everyone, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and follow us online on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram on our handle Muslim Matters. And check out our site daily at muslimmatters.org. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.